Hi, everybody. How you doing? Yeah. How you doing, though, for real? I mean, we can be terrible. There's terrible times. You don't have to be enthusiastic. But I think we have a lot to be enthusiastic about tonight, right? We get to hear about this amazing book, which I am so excited to help present to all of you tonight. My name, by the way, is Aidan Flax-Clark. I am the director of Live from NYPL. So I am, of course, very thrilled you're here. Very thrilled to everyone who's watching us online. And as you know, we are here to learn about an unlikely presidential story from a rather unlikely source. John Quincy Adams from bass player turned historian Bob Crawford. How about that, huh? The book, as you all know, is called America's Founding Son, which I had the great pleasure to read last year, and it is truly excellent and an excellent companion to Bob's podcast, Founding Son, also the story of John Quincy Adams. Hopefully you all saw that the book is available out there for purchase, yeah? And hopefully you have all purchased roughly 8 million copies already. But if you did not, that's okay. There is time to purchase it afterward. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library, and I believe Bob is signing it afterward. I have to double check with that. Either way, you should definitely buy it. And if you can't, you must have a library card, yeah? Of course. That would be bananas. You would be a bonkers crazy person to not have a library card and come here. You can, of course, check the book out, although I'm willing to bet there are many holds on it because I think this is going to be a very popular book. We are also thrilled that this event is happening with fellow presidential historian, the great Alexis Coe, still the reigning champion of best book title ever, You Never Forget Your First, her book about George Washington. Also available for purchase outside, so if you're feeling extra hungry for presidential biographies, we are here to sate your appetite. Alexis and Bob's bios are in your programs, and if you're watching online, they are on the website as well. John Quincy Adams is probably tied with Jimmy Carter for greatest ex-president, but he is really not well remembered. And in this year, when the nation is celebrating its 250th anniversary, we are grateful for opportunities like tonight to highlight pivotal but sometimes overlooked figures in our nation's history, especially those whose work has really helped shape more of our politics and national identity than we really know. And I mention that because I'm sure that you know a lot of institutions this year are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and we are no exception. We happen to have a very cool copy of the Declaration of Independence in Thomas Jefferson's handwriting and like many other incredible things. And we are going to open major multiple exhibitions starting in May celebrating the 250th anniversary, 3 of them right here in this building. And on top of that, there are going to be programs and educational offerings and a whole lot more. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, and I'm guessing maybe a couple of you are American history nerds, I don't know, just a guess, go to nypl.org/US250 and you can learn more, and more information is to come in the weeks ahead. When you walked in the room, you got printed programs. They came with note cards. Those are for asking questions. Bob will be glad to take some of your questions at the end of tonight. I always encourage you, please phrase your questions in the form of questions. And if you're watching online, you can put them in the chat and we will get them there wherever you are. We would love to hear from you. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and much more importantly, by all of you here. So thank you again very much for being here, and let's please give it up for Alexis Coe and Bob Crawford.
Hello, good evening, welcome. And first, congratulations to Bob.
Thank you.
This is his
Thank you
launch.
for all being here. Thank you.
It's his debut book. And it's always a pleasure to be back. We were chatting when this was, the introductions were happening, but I used to work here. And we just quickly before this went and visited some of the treasures, and you were here earlier today filming a segment to promote the book and looking at, and we were just really talking about how this is, it's the people's palace, but it's also just, it's a historian's dream. It's a utopia for us.
It is overwhelming in a beautiful way, and you're all lucky to, those of you that are New Yorkers and live here and get to spend time here, you're all very lucky.
So we have been in conversation many times before, but I have never been in this seat. Bob has always interviewed me on his various podcasts and radio shows, and he guest hosts a lot, and then I feel like I'm always in. It's a pleasure.
I'm like, who can I get to do this? Well, let's call
someone
Alexis.
I can text. And we were introduced by a mutual friend a couple of years ago. I remember it was warm enough. I was on a walk and we were talking, and I'll do a 10-minute call or something. But immediately, I was invested in this book because you were approaching it with something that I think does. Sometimes there's some hubris involved, and certainly any member of the Adams family, they're a gift and a curse to American historians. But I think humility is something that made each Adams great, and their humility in particular to really important subjects. And that was how you approached this book. You really wanted to get everything right. You were, anything I said that you didn't necessarily readily understand, you wanted to know, you were really curious, you wanted to do it right. And more than that, that was the most important entry. And you wanted it to be good and to contribute something to the shelf, not just crowd it. And I've just finished it, and you did it.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did it.
Thank you. I remember that conversation well, Alexis, and I remember I was like more than halfway through writing the book, and after I got off the phone with you, I was in a complete panic. And yeah, I was just terrified. But no, yes, but seriously, thank you. You were so generous with your time and so generous to share with me your personal experiences and some things that I needed to be aware of. And it was so important to me to write a book that is very accessible and, can I say, fun in some way about a serious topic, but also to be rigorous in that and to really show my work in the back of the book. That was like so important. And I can't thank you enough for all your advice.
You're very welcome. And when he says the back of the book, that's like the way I've never heard it said, which is citations, and which were all fact checked, and it's really excellent.
You know, I like to say, I just came up with this a couple days ago. Party in the front, rigor in the back. Because you talked about rigor. You used the word rigor.
Always, yes.
When we spoke. And so rigor was just kind of always going through my head. Rigor. And so
research must be rigorous. So give us, let's get into it. Give us, you have a very good, I was saying, we talked the other day and I said, it takes a while to get your elevator pitch down. Like right when, you hit the 2-week mark, and he has it. He had it, 2 days before.
Well, the elevator pitch for publishers was, this is a beach read. This is a history beach read. But the elevator pitch for John Quincy Adams is he's the 19th century's greatest public servant, perhaps one of the, if not the greatest public servant in our nation's history. He is the man standing in the breach between Washington and Lincoln. He is our tie to the nation's founding documents, to our nation's founding, and to Lincoln. Washington, now I'm past the elevator. Now the elevator has stopped. But Washington appoints him to his first diplomatic post, and he serves with Lincoln in Congress. And so he truly touches these two periods of our history that we've been taught are separate. They are complete separate eras. But he is the tie between the two.
And there's been a lot of talk whenever we talk about John Quincy Adams. There's so much passion among historians for him. I love him. It's like Quincy, Chester A. Arthur. Those are people I would like to invite to the table, but often am told absolutely not. And so I think, but so the press and the marketing, it's like overlooked. I think of him as just underrated, like criminally underrated. And there are moments when that changed throughout even in our era. Amistad, for example, when the movie came out, there was sort of a moment, but not much. And I'll say why we should study him, why you wanted to study him for the next question, but I'm going to ask you why, why do you think he was underread? And I have a theory, which is that, the Adams family, they have this problem, which is that the whole family evolved.
They have a lot of problems.
They have a lot of problems,
Yeah.
which they talk about at length in multiple letters, because once they wrote to one person, they had to write the same thing to 5 others. And the vocabulary on them. But
yeah. Well, they were wordy, and I don't want to stop you.
Yeah.
But they were, and this is really just become super evident to me. Of course, New England Puritans, of course, they come from that, but
never not moved to
speak. So Puritan.
Yeah.
In the self-criticism, the self-denial, and in the wordiness. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, just constantly, and which was important, self-evaluating. But the problem is, it's almost too much between the diaries and the letters, and just it's almost overwhelming. He's so productive. He has so many, Washington he did a lot of great things, but it's the revolution, it's the presidency, and then he leaves. He's celebrated for leaving in a lot of ways.
He really
and
is.
So this is not, Quincy was going to overstay. He was the person you had to ask to leave.
Yeah.
And I mean, he died in a day.
He literally died at his desk.
Yes. And so there's not, because they could kind of be a lot, there's not the same affinity from the public. And I think no one has done him the great service of changing that, because there are a lot of books on John Quincy Adams, but none of them have really broken through. And I think he needs different books. This is one of them, but there are a lot of different books that he needs. And so I wonder, is that why you wrote the book? I don't think I've ever asked you that. And what do you think will sort of rescue him from this sort of odd obscurity?
Well, the thing about him, so there's a lot of books about him, and there are a lot of great books about him. And my favorite, I think, is the Bemis, Samuel Flagg Bemis, and that's 2 volumes.
Yeah.
And so this is not the length of your typical John Quincy Adams book, and that's because there's so much to him. Yeah. He literally lived an act in a life in 3 acts, and there were so many things that I was like, this book is about Adams and the years 1820 to 1848. It's about his struggle and the issue of slavery and his relationship with the abolitionists. And that's it. A lot of people want to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, and I'm happy to talk about that as best as I can, but that's not what's in this book. And there's so many little things that happen to him. So when you read, a lot of these great John Quincy Adams books, they've got everything that ever happened. The Smithsonian. Do you know how involved he was in the establishment of the Smithsonian Institute? You're not going to learn it here, but he did. But he was really involved in it. Yeah. And so, why doesn't he have a seat at the table? Right? Why? Because he had a failed one-term presidency. And so, when we think about presidential history and we're rating presidents, we think about their presidency. Now, if he was president in the 1960s or 50s, he would have had a great presidency.
He never would have been elected after TV was invented.
No, he would not have been. But he is so deserving, right, of our inquiry and our research and of our time. But it's not because of his presidency. It's because of, I believe, because he's our most extraordinary post-president.
Ooh,
all due respect to President Carter. Yeah. All due respect to President Carter. He deserves it. But I think I got a pretty solid case in saying that Adams is truly our greatest post-presidency.
And it is that sort of narrow approach that he demands. And there's so much we don't know. This is irrelevant. sort of. But he had this lost weekend in Sweden, and we just know that it happened because one of his sisters kept teasing him about it for the rest of his life. But obviously it was very good, and I would love to know about it.
It was nothing like John Lennon's Lost Weekend.
And I think, so this is, you mentioned, you landed that beautifully into my next question, which was, you know, we talk about the whole family growing up against the backdrop of the American story. But for John Quincy Adams, he's hitting the ground running. You know, as a child, he's watching Bunker Hill, and then he's traveling abroad. He's not really going to school. His education is, you know, shilling for the revolution in Europe and Russia, and he's like the ultimate George Washington fanboy. He has a poster of him essentially at his, you know, dorm room at The Hague, and they love him. But this is. He's not the only child, obviously. There are a lot of children of the founders and the framers. But we have Quincy, we have Caroline Kennedy, and we have Beau Biden, and otherwise it's a lot of ne'er-do-well. It's not good. And in particular, like there were founders, presidents' sons who were in debtor's prison. So you have Quincy, and my favorite Abigail Adams quote is, "Not all my geese are swans." But obviously he was the swan. So I think she said of much is given, much is expected.
Right.
And that man exceeded expectations every single time. So you call him America's founding son, which of course I'm like, wow, yeah. And he was the favorite for good reason. He was a fanboy who cared, right? And being
he was also a Washington blogger.
Oh yeah, he was essentially.
Like he was. I mean, he wrote these pamphlets in defense of Washington at a time that Washington was taking on a lot of criticism.
Yeah, he was like a youthful influencer in some ways, and he. Being a founder's child actually meant to him in daily life, you know, that he did interact with them a lot, and he wanted them to be proud, but he was also really deeply interested and invested in the work of life, which was so entangled in the work of America and of the infant nation. And so I'm wondering, you know, what moments did you see that he was coming into, because he was his father and his mother's son, but he was also very much his own person. And I see that happening like with Kennedy when he's at Harvard. And so I'm wondering, you know, when are these moments you see him break with his family just a little bit and become his own person? Because that's another thing we don't really talk about. He had a lot in common with them, but also had disagreements.
Yeah, I think we see it in the context of what I covered here, specifically when he's in the Senate, when he's a senator from Massachusetts. So Washington appointed him to his first diplomatic post, and then his father became president, appointed him to another, asked Washington's permission to do so because he didn't want his son to be a Nepo baby. Washington says, no, we got to have him. No, he is an asset. He spoke a lot of languages. He was a great listening post for a president in Europe because he spoke so many languages. But then so Jefferson wins the election, defeats his father, and his father recalls him from the diplomatic service because he doesn't want his son to experience being fired by the man who beat him in the election. And you know, I don't know if Jefferson would have fired him, to be honest with you. I don't know. But because, you know, when JQA was young and in Paris during the Revolution, he would go to the opera with Jefferson. Like, they hung out. They went to great restaurants together and went to the theater. So JQA later learned to hate Jefferson, but that's a different story. But so after he's recalled from his diplomatic mission in Prussia, when his father's president and leaves office, he goes to the Senate. He becomes a senator from Massachusetts. He's a Federalist. And this is where he becomes a maverick. He begins to back a few of Jefferson's policies, some that were very unpopular with Federalists, like the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act. And so that's where I think taking a stand and letting politics be damned, I think that is something that differentiates himself in a way from perhaps his parents.
Very much so.
Like,
I mean, yeah.
meaning,
Yeah.
not that John Adams wouldn't have said exactly what he felt,
Yes.
right? But I feel like that's JQA defining himself personally,
Right.
because he was under so much pressure from his parents. There's that famous quote, and I only quote the second half of it, but if you do not rise to the head of not only your profession but of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness, slovenliness, and obstinacy. And if any of you, I know I'm going to make these funny, it's up to you if they're funny or not, but I grew up in the 80s, right? I remember Animal House. There's a line in Animal House that's probably not very politically correct these days, but John Belushi's told, fat, drunk, and stupid's no way to go through life. And that quote, that John Adams quote to his son, John Quincy, that's what that makes me think of. And the pressure that John and Abigail put on all of their sons, 2 of the 3 could not bear it and died early, in their adulthood and were alcoholics. So, Adams had it in him, and this is the Puritan in him, to do better, to always do better. He keeps a diary from the time he's a teenager until his death. Why did he keep a 14,000-page diary? Because if he forgot to write a day, he was ashamed of himself for not writing. He was like super hard on himself in everything he did. And so you talk about defining himself. He had to define himself. Because there was as much pressure, I think, from his parents to define himself as to carry on and preserve the union they sacrificed so much for.
And it was interesting because he had this like unrelenting curiosity and sort of energy that Hamilton has, but it was somehow less abrasive. Yeah. Those diaries are also riddled with marginalia that I really love. There are a lot of like etchings of ships and different things, and he was always sharing what he couldn't, write, and their hands. Like I can't even imagine.
Alexis, can I say something?
Yeah, please.
He wanted to be a literary man.
Yeah.
He wanted to write poetry and literature and great novels. And he was a classical man in the Romantic era. And so that really didn't take off for him. But he left behind, I think, the greatest work of American literature of the 19th century is his diary.
Yeah.
Is his diary. Yeah. And not just because of its scope and its breadth. And if you read a history book that's about American political history in the 19th century, first half of the 19th century, I almost guarantee you, whether that book's about John Quincy Adams or not, it is a source, probably a major source in the back of that book. It has been used. But again, with the pressure, he wants to define himself as a young man, as an artist, but the pressure to be so much more from his family drove him.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, he lived in these extremes. That was his life. He left, he came back to America to go to Harvard, and he was, the amount of pressure even in that transition, to just transition immediately back to normal life as if he had gone to school like all these other kids. But you write in this similar fashion, long hours, quiet domestic life, lots of study where he could fit it in. So your life as a, there's been a lot of sort of coverage about you being in a band and writing this book, and I more think of them as not being this like discrete spaces, because you're sort of always bringing these things with you. And I think the way you think about music is similar to the way you think about the stories that we tell, but there are citations. And in the archives, you took it with you, right? You saw in the archives some of his darker days. You see them on their best days and their worst days. And his self-doubt, his 14,000-page diary. And then you would do this work on the road in between shows, living this sort of similar peripatetic life. And so what was it like to sort of carry that kind of energy along with your own life that's kind of all over the place, and those sort of similarities, those things that you see in him.
It's like I tell myself I don't want to put it this way, but it's just the truth. The truth is that, like, I don't know what originally captivated me about American history, but I've always been interested in it, and I've always been just aware of it. And I think it's like part of the, there's so much to it. Like part of it's like the times in which I was raised. There were 4 channels, not anything you want to see, anything you can conjure. Oh man, I found Louis Armstrong performing with Jimmy Durante on YouTube a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this exists, like this happens. And now I'll be asking myself if it's AI. I don't think it was. I'm pretty sure they played Old Man Time, which is an amazing song if you know that one. But it was 4 channels, so if it was the local news, I was watching it. And then because my dad would come home from work, he worked at a grocery store. He'd come home at 5 o'clock. He'd sit on the couch. My mother would bring him his dinner, and it was the local news, and then it was the national news, Walter Cronkite, and then if there was a debate on, it was the debate, and my parents would complain about it because they hated it, but I watched it, and I loved the spectacle of it, the conventions. Watched all of those. It was just breaking news. Oh my gosh, like that thing would come on and your heart would stop, and it was just so. And I really think that's why I was a TV kid. And here I go. I hope my kids don't see this because now I won't have any leg to stand on telling them to put the screens down. But I think that's what made me fertile for American history. And I was never a great student, but if it was a history class, I just did well. I didn't even have to try. So on the bus, and it's just been such a long, slow growth of this trade, of this practice of history. And it was just one thing after another. First I've talked about David McCullough and his importance to me personally in the early 2000s. And that led me to reading Sean Wilentz and his book, Rise of American Democracy. That was just that period that this book is about. That just ripped it open. It exposed, like, when you find a new TV show that you love, and you're just like, I need to binge this. And that's exactly what it was like. Then it was like The Age of Jackson, Schlesinger, and all of these books about this period that I didn't know existed. It had to exist because something had to happen between 1789 and 1861, but I didn't know what happened, right? And so learning about it, but then getting to the point where I am practicing it, right? From a podcast to doing research and writing a podcast series or writing a book, it became this wonderful refuge. So that's the word I just didn't want to use. I don't want to use, but for me, it's a place I can go and get into this. Maybe someone who collects, does anybody collect stamps anymore, or coins, or baseball cards? But it's like a place where you go in your garage, you go in the basement, wherever your space is, and I am in reading his diary. I am in his world. I am. You find a letter. You hear him trash talking John C. Calhoun or something, and you read about that, and you're just like, man, this is great. There's, what's better than this? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a great privilege. So this is a silly question, but again, so you've lived in Adams' diary and in his head and with him for years now. You've lived inside a tour bus for long periods of time, which it feels is, small.
Almost 20 years in a bus, 25 years.
So let's say
in a moving vehicle.
We drop John Quincy Adams, into your tour bus on a road trip, long drives, bad coffee, big crowds.
He did share a space with with Henry Clay for a while.
Oh, don't get me started on Henry Clay.
That didn't go well.
Yeah, it's another fun. I love Amy Greenberg's A Wicked War, about the Mexican-American War. It's one of the best books. Anyway, so he's he's on your tour bus. What about his personality is going to get him kicked off the tour bus?
I don't know who's grumpier, me or him.
Ah, this is another point of connection.
Who can be grumpier? Who you assume you're grumpy, you're like.
He's very grumpy.
Like there's people, right? And it's like, who's gonna be able to be grumpy? Because only one person can be grumpy. I think he would be the grumpiest.
It's funny. I don't get the same. You can sort of tell when someone's annoyed from the 50s and 40s, as far as 20th century. But the founders, you can really tell when they're annoyed.
Oh well, Adams. John Quincy Adams. That was his baseline. Was annoying, annoyed.
So in this, we have this political culture that treats, power like oxygen. And the truly unthinkable move for any president in this era would be to go back to Congress. But to me, that's essentially like the most I'm the best son of the founders move, because they wanted the reason there's unfortunately a floor and not a ceiling on the presidency is that the framers thought, of course, you'll want to go through Congress. It's the most important place. And then after you get, your education in that, you'll go and you'll be president. But we haven't seen anyone really go back in this way. So it has like the most founding son energy of anything.
Alexis, the only other person who went back was the opposite of John Quincy Adams. Who can you imagine was like the complete opposite as a president or as a public servant than John Quincy Adams, who was a former president? Andrew Johnson. He gets impeached. I think he survives removal by like the skin of his teeth. And he goes back into the Senate.
Yeah.
But he dies.
But he does very poorly.
He died 5 months later. So Adams was in Congress for 18 years. But Johnson's like, he goes back because like, well, what am I going to do now?
They don't want him at home, I'll tell you that.
Right, yeah. They want him. They have a statue of him in North Carolina.
So this is fairly well known, but when you get into it, that he went back, and we know the highlights, we know the cases, we know about the gag rule, but what really surprised you in this process? What did you find that you feel like was not or was downplayed in other books that you feel like you gave it its rightful place?
Right. So the challenge for all of these John Quincy Adams biographers, and there's a few that tried to be specific in shorter time periods, but like you're trying to, like I said earlier, like cover all the bases. I wanted to highlight his relationship with these two abolitionists, Benjamin Lundy and Theodore Weld. And when I would read a book about John Quincy Adams, these guys would pop up, and it'd be a sentence here, a paragraph there. I was like, became really fascinated with them. And if I went through a phase like, I want to write a book about Benjamin Lundy. Because no one's done that since, like, I think the 50s or 60s.
And your agent was like, yeah.
That's going to work. Or I want to write about Theodore Weld. Oh, my God. Like, Theodore Weld is so much better than William Lloyd Garrison. Like Weld didn't have any ego. Like, he didn't want you to print what he was saying in his speeches. He didn't want to be out front. Garrison was all about himself and being out front. If there's any Garrison scholars and I'm getting it wrong, I apologize. We can talk about it. But so there were these two other figures. And what was fascinating in the context of Adams to me was that here is a man that's known for his being cold. And his son said he wore an iron mask. But he had these really intimate relationships with these two abolitionists, men who were not from his station in life, right? Men who were gritty. They were like literally, Lundy walks across Mexico 3 times, walks up to Canada. He's traveling south where he's notorious for being an abolitionist, and so he's got to go in disguise. It's like Weld is giving these anti-slavery speeches in Ohio, and in New York, where he's being pelted by rocks. Like he's at the pulpit of a church one night giving a speech, and rock comes through the window and smashes him in the head. And Adams had so much respect for these people. Like I think I don't want to say envied, but he admired their principles. And I'll tell you why. Adams, and this goes to his Puritanism again, he was a moral man. He was so moral that almost, maybe self-righteous, but he was also, he was trapped by his morality in some ways. Because, again, just as he would write in his diary and he would trash somebody, he was always harder on himself. And I think his morality is driven by his parents and by his Puritanism and by his work ethic. But no, I think he saw Lundy and Weld, and he, because they weren't, Adams was, we would think of him as racist. He couldn't imagine, he abhorred slavery, but he couldn't imagine the society we live in today. But Weld and Lundy, they could, and they did. And that's what made them so dangerous and so powerful. And so Lundy's from this older generation, this Quaker kind of old school generation of abolitionism. Weld is from this fiery, millennialist kind of Charles Finney, Second Great Awakening. Yeah, we're going to make change. How are you going to do that? We don't know, but we're doing it, And Adams is in between, right? He has a relationship with both of these men. And so he's this weird conduit for these two radicals.
He was really admiring of people who were innately good.
Yeah.
And this is interesting because Adams is, Abigail Adams is well known. I think my first sort of interest in American history definitely came from that chapter that 3 sentences maybe in a chapter about Abigail Adams, Remember the Ladies. And she's imploring her husband when the revolution is won, remember the ladies. And she's asking for basically an equality that is unheard of. And that there's so much emphasis on that, but not on his response, which is basically bless your heart. Right. Oh no, we know not to do that. But there's a big difference between John Adams and John Quincy Adams in the way that his relationships with women. He is close to his sisters. He has Louisa Adams. There's also a great book by Louisa Thomas on Louisa Adams. His wife was
she is an incredible
interesting
figure.
Yeah,
Louisa Catherine Adams, the first lady who was not born in the United States.
Yeah,
but she was a writer herself, and in a lot of ways he held her down. Yeah. Even while he had, there's a character in this book, and I say character, but there's a woman who lived, and her name was Angelina Grimke. And so Theodore Weld, who was the greatest of his time abolitionist, and Angelina Grimke, who was the greatest woman abolitionist, they get married. They're like this power couple, seriously. And they met in the newspaper. They met in the newspaper because they read about each other. And William Lee Miller, who has a great book about Adams in Congress, he said this. He's like, this is an example of a couple meeting in the newspaper in the 19th century. But they truly did, because they had this great admiration for each other. And they get married, and Weld takes a step back, and he stops going on the road and doing these, he's going across Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York, and he's setting up these anti-slavery societies. So he's giving these fiery speeches, and he's winning people over to the cause. And they get married, and he has a situation where he gets kind of injured in doing that, and he becomes a writer for the movement. He writes this book called Slavery as It Is, and it inspires. What is that book? Beecher Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe. He inspires her. His book inspires her. And it's such a powerful book that when Adams and Weld finally meet, Adams says, "Oh, Mr. Weld, I know you by your writings." But when Weld takes a step back from the movement, from being out the face of the movement, Angelina steps in. And she becomes the first woman to address a state legislature. She gives this famous speech in Pennsylvania Hall, where that there's a mob outside, and they're throwing rocks through the window, and they're threatening to burn down the hall, and she gives a speech while this mob's outside, and she's calling out the mob, and it's just an incredible speech. I talk about it in the book. But Adams was so referential to Angelina Grimke and to Lucretia Mott and these other women of the abolitionist movement. And he didn't give his wife the same deference, I don't think.
He's very dismissive in their letters.
Yeah.
That there's always a lot of letters between any Adams couple,
Yeah.
but they're it's devoid of the. I think modern therapists would call it four horsemen for sure.
Yeah, I know they loved each other. And in fact, Weld says this because Weld writes to Angelina. Weld comes to D.C. and he kind of becomes Adams's congressional aide for a while. He's like the first congressional aide, is like how I like to think of him. And he writes home to Angelina and says, I thought you said that Mr. and Mrs. Adams didn't like each other. He's like, when I met him, he took me by the arm and took me across to meet her and introduced, they were very sweet to each other. So I know they loved each other. And they've been through so much. They lost a daughter. They lost 2 adult sons. But Adams, he couldn't have been a picnic to be married to.
It's hard in divisive times, although I always say partisanship has been divisive since the beginning. We have Washington's farewell address as evidence of that. But, we have this Trump again moment, and people are desperate to believe or hope or have no faith in the system working. And what I'm always reminded of when you travel with John Quincy Adams is that progress is glacial. Washington wanted the progress from slavery to abolitionism to be almost imperceptible, and it felt like that many times. But you do see him trying and building calmly this case in the way that some of the people he associated with he knew could not build the case that he could build. And so you see him doing this in this sort of trained from his teen years as a diplomat. You see him doing this and persevering. And so is that sort of, how did that feel also against this backdrop for you writing it? Is that something that you want the readers to have faith in institutions? Do you see connections between sort of these moments of despair that he had and what you see around us?
Adams is so great because he realizes in 1836 they passed this gag rule in Congress where you couldn't mention slavery on the floor of the House of Representatives. And this is the kind of the turn in his life where he realizes he can't avoid this subject. Like he wants to basically, I'm sorry, scratch all that. In this time, if you wanted to get a message to your congressman, you didn't fill out an email, write in on their email, or visit their local office. You had to. You sent a petition to them. Maybe you were petitioning for the restoration of your father's Revolutionary War pension. Maybe you were a sailmaker in New York, and you were petitioning for the tariff to be relieved so you can make some money. What starts to happen in the 1830s is abolitionists begin to send anti-slavery petitions to the House, and they send them by the wagon load. And so Adams would get up and read them and say, I don't agree that Congress has the ability to end slavery in the states where it exists, but I'm reading this for my constituent. And he would read these petitions. And there were a few other congressmen who read. He was not the only one, but there were not many. And what begins to happen there's a few uprisings of enslaved people. Denmark Vesey in Charleston, Nat Turner also in Virginia. And Southerners begin to get nervous in Congress. They're like, these abolitionists, the word's getting out what they're saying, and it's coming down south. And somehow our enslaved people are hearing it, And it's giving them ideas we don't want them to have. So these petitions coming to Congress, we don't want to hear about. We don't want them. Well, that's it. We're cutting them off. So they passed the gag rule. So you can't read these petitions anymore on the floor of Congress. And that was the moment Adams was like, okay, we're no longer talking about emancipation, which I agree, we're probably not there yet. But now you're taking away the First Amendment. You're taking away a person's First Amendment right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. You take away the right to petition, you're going to take away the right to peaceably assemble, the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and that got him in the fight. Like, that got him off the bench, and that is like the turn in his life where he gets on the road. So he tells these abolitionists, so the abolitionists, they love this. They're like, oh man, we got a guy on the inside. And he tells them, he's like, I'm not your guy. I'm not an abolitionist. And as he grows, but he'll go hang out with him in Philadelphia. He spends his birthday one time in Philadelphia. He hangs out with Lundy. They go over to the Motts. They're hanging out there, and he talks about in his diary. He's like, oh, the only embarrassment of the night was me talking so much and taking control of the conversation. Like, you can tell this is a different guy. Like, this guy, this cold man with an iron mask, he has found his people, and he can just hang out with these guys, and he loves it. And then after this party with the Motts, he and Lundy go out, and they're hanging out like for another 2 or 3 hours, like talking. And so he finally tells them, he's like, look, it's better if I'm not one of you. Like, look, I will work to defend your freedom of speech. And that will do more for your movement than you could imagine. And really, right now, it's probably the best we can hope for. And so he becomes this fellow traveler with the abolitionists. But like you said, it's like he writes, by the way, right after the gag rule, he says, I'm entering, I think I put it in the beginning of the book, I'm entering in this cause that I will not live to see come to fruition. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. He's like, but the cause is good and great. And if I carry it forward, someone else will pick it up. And that's kind of this idea of, like, right now we're in this moment that, nothing is inevitable. Like, you read history and everything that happened, it wasn't inevitable that it was going to happen. As studying Washington, sometimes a gust of wind in a different direction makes all the difference, right? And so Adams understood this. He understood that history wasn't inevitable, and we're in this moment. We're always in this moment, but right now it's palpable, right? We can taste it. We're all very anxious. There's a lot of anxiety. It's like it's bearing down on all of us. And I think Adams is instructive to us now, the perseverance, that we need to just persevere, do what is right, stand up, be heard, be counted. That's the best we can do.
And be principled. I mean, that's what we keep hearing. That's what, again, in the farewell address, Washington specifically says that the problem with parties is that they are governed by unprincipled men. And so when you have someone who disagrees with the outcome itself, like slavery, like emancipation, but he does feel as if the principles that allow the conversation to happen have to remain no matter who is in power, no matter what the subject is, that maybe that is the hope for the future. And that speaks to our thank you to the audience for filling out these questions. They were all good. I hope we get to most of them. I am going to combine some. And so
I can stay here all night.
And there are three that are sort of in the same vein. And one of the questions was, would it be possible in today's world for let's say, a former president, to repeat what JQA did as a congressman, a senator, a chief justice? So we're talking about Taft.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
But they need to step up and do it. It is so, I can't imagine it. Like, you're president, you're done. You can go give speeches and make a lot of money. You can write a book. You're going to make a lot of money. Why go into Congress? Why deal with that crap? But I think and I'm just because there are so few former presidents, but like I don't know, I think W or Obama, and I think maybe that time's passed for W, but if Obama, like, could you imagine if he went into Congress? Like what that would say? What that would just that action of doing that would send a message that public service, there's not like, we think of like everything as rising from the bottom to the top, but isn't public service just all around us? It's not a matter of top and bottom. And, that would be amazing. Of course, he has a right to do what he wants to do.
Well, it's interesting to think about. If Obama, there was so much talk about becoming a Supreme Court justice.
By the way, another thing not in this book, Madison tried to appoint JQA to the Supreme Court, and he passed. He's like,
No, it was also in like a basement of a building at that point. It was not a great situation. So one of the questions is, why don't more presidents go into Congress? Actually, to your point, I think another answer to that was this relates to the second question, the third, which was, I don't know, Clinton, if he didn't have all those legal bills and then became
I think his time has passed as well.
Yeah,
as far,
for
just as far as
sure.
age. But it's like, this is a good retort. If I were Obama, who we've kind of singled him out because he's young enough to do it, he'd say, "Why would I want to go into Congress? Have you ever tried to deal with those guys?"
Yeah.
That would be my Obama retort.
This is a hypothetical, and I sort of hate hypotheticals but love hypotheticals. So I'll ask. It's not for me, so I'm going to ask it. Who in the current administration would JQA like the least?
Here's what he said about John Tyler. He would said, talent's not above mediocrity. I think he'd have something else to say. I don't think he'd like, come on, we know. He wouldn't like any of them.
Yeah. Although I always say they would be like, oh my God, what is happening here? Before they got excited about,
Here's the thing about Adams. If he was alive today, he would have told us this was going to happen 20 years ago. And he would not be surprised at all. And he would, what he would say? He would say, I kind of expected it to happen sooner, because he was his diary is a testament to this. He was such a keen observer of human nature. He understood humanity and the human heart and what people were both positively capable of, but often disappointingly capable of. And so he would not be surprised by any of this.
What is your favorite random fact about JQA? And I encourage you to make it the least consequential.
I have to think about it then.
Mm-hmm.
Random fact.
There's not like a fun...
I can pull one. I
Yeah.
to make a favorite.
Right. Well, don't have a favorite. Just like what's a you tailor it usually to the group, right?
So here you're in deep. Okay, so first of all, primarysourcecoop.org. Primarysourcecoop.org. It's somehow the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is another great institution like this one. They digitized Adams's diary, and there's a database, and you can search a name. You can search a date. You can search a phrase.
Random word.
Pretty
really
amazing.
Fun.
So I look up Beethoven.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, what way you thought of Beethoven? Wow, that'd be cool. And he mentions Beethoven twice, maybe 3 times. And one time he goes to a party and there's oratorio singers singing a Beethoven piece. And he's like, it was okay. Like really, and it was Beethoven was young at the time. So he was like, yeah, we talked about this Beethoven. Yeah, I don't know if they maybe didn't do a great job. He was very critical. If he came to your performance, he would go to, okay, let me finish the Beethoven thing, and I got something else that may be my favorite random fact that I would love to write a book about, but no publisher in their right mind would allow me to do so. So I might just have to do it for fun. So the other Beethoven references are from like the 1840s, like 45, 46. And because if you're a congressman, you can let your friends borrow books from the Library of Congress. And so he lets this guy borrow a book about Beethoven. And he talks about, Beethoven is the master. I let so-and-so, who's a very elderly man. He's like, this man is very elderly. I don't know what position he had in life. But Adams gets him this book on Beethoven. And then the next time he mentions it, he's like, so-and-so has neglected to return the book on Beethoven. So that's kind of cool. That's so JQA. Yeah. But this is a great random fact. And it speaks to his love of theology, his dedication to his faith, and his knack for being critical of everything. He would go to at least three church services every Sunday. And in his diary, he would analyze the sermons, and he would point out which minister didn't do so good. And he'd be like, well, this was the verse that they were preaching on, and really his sermon had nothing to do with the verse. Like, he really wasn't very good. Or if it was good, he would say, oh, that was just really powerful. But I would love a theology book about Adams and his view on theology, and a collection of his, only I would like this. Like, really, I should just write it for myself, and I just have it for myself. But maybe Scott Avett would enjoy it. Maybe he would enjoy it. But that would be it in the whole world. So we'd print 2 copies.
Probably get
and there might be a few people at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So we'll
15.
print. Okay, we're going to print. This is a vanity project, and we're going to print 20 copies of this book.
There is a question about craft, which we haven't really gotten to that much. Has your experience of writing your first book, well, I think also it should start with, how was it? And did it prepare you for the second or next project?
It did, because as with anything new, you just, as you learn as you go. And you talk to Alexis Coe, and then you're like terrified, and you're like screaming into the backyard at midnight in terror. Then you learn more, and like I could just do it so much better. Like, they're just things that this is what it is, and this is the best that this is.
That's how you always feel.
Right. And by the way, every historian I've talked to, they hate their book. Like, they get to a point where they hate their books.
But then sometimes you open up and you're like, this isn't so bad.
I talked to the person who connected us, wrote like 4 or 5 history books. He's like, and I was like going through this point, and he's like, I asked him for some advice, and he's like, man, just tell the story. He's like, I read my first book, and I'm trying to be like this writer and write this like eloquent, flowery language. He said, I love people who when they're like, they tell a story about an anecdote about their life to make the point they're trying to make. He's like, I was a caddy when I was a young man. He's like, I watched a lot of bad golf. Then you see these guys come in, they're 70 years old, and they're just taking this easy swing. Like, these young guys are trying to hit the ball 350 yards, and it's going way out here, it's going way out here. Then you get this 70-year-old man, and he just takes this nice and easy swing, and it's just 80 yards, 110 yards, just straight down the fairway. He's like, just tell the story. That's all you got to do is tell the story. And so, I learned as I went. And so, yeah, I have ways in my mind at this point where I could be more efficient and editing. Yeah, there's so many things I was editing right up to the end, to the point where the editor, Sarah Reed, who's amazing, she was amazing. She was so supportive and so encouraging, to the point where I was like, are you really reading any of this? Or are you just saying this stuff? But some point, she's like, you got to put the pen down. You got to stop. You got to stop. And I think I was over-editing. I was just over-editing. I don't know. But yeah, I could do it better and different.
I say that every time.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to tell you. I think, however, that is what makes you good at this. And it's an excellent book. And I think we're all so glad that you wrote it and that you shared it with us tonight. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much for being here.
signing.
How are you?
How are you?
It's so good to see you.
Good to see you. Congratulations. Oh my God, my pleasure. Just for you. It still smells slightly of blue. I made you bookmarks.
I forgot to say.